Alright, we're going to get the stream started. So, on Saturday, the Hamas led a strike against Israel where they paraglided in. They sent a bunch of missiles, which second. They sent so many missiles that it was able to distract Israel's Iron Dome that to let the other let other missiles in. So a bunch of missiles hit in Israel all over. They flew in on paragliders. And they went through the border wall. I don't know exactly where at on the wall they went through. I think it was right around here. Maybe I don't know exactly. Or here, maybe. We could look on here. Following Saturday, surprise attack by Hamas militants. Israel has retaliated by its siege of Gaza, cutting off water. Yeah, they cut off after the attack by Hamas. Israel reacted by cutting off water to Gaza, food, power, and everything else, because all of the food and water and electricity come through Israel into Gaza. Just this little thing, space right here, the Gaza Strip. This is ocean right here, or sea, I mean. And then I don't know much about the history of Gaza and Israel. I just know that after World War II, Israel became its own country. I think it was in 46, I think, that Israel became. Yeah. And then there's like 2 million people in just this little tiny area of Gaza. And I think that in Israel there's like 9 million people. Yeah, so I think we're going to start off the stream by watching videos about the history of Palestine and Israel. I was thinking that we could do 2 different ones. Maybe Ben Shapiro, because he's definitely going to be more on an Israel side, and then this one seems like it's probably going to be more of a Palestinian belief, or maybe this one. We'll see. So here, we'll turn on Ben Shapiro. We'll watch what this was posted 2 years ago, so there's stuff that happened after that
Alrighty, so today we're going to talk about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian-Arab conflict. In order to discuss that history, we have to go back in time, like way, way back in time. First, this particular video is sponsored by our friends over at ExpressVPN. The Jewish homeland has always been the dream in Israel. Okay, to understand how tiny this slot of land is, you kind of have to look at this map. Okay, so this tiny area right here covers Israel and actually some other countries. Okay, the entire map, if you were to zoom out and take a look at the Arab world, what you would see is this enormous swath of the globe, and then you would see like this tiny pinprick about half the size of New Jersey, and that constitutes modern-day Israel.
thought
It's
that
a
it was the
very,
size
very
of
small
New Jersey.
plot of land. And if you were to look at this area, like the narrowest part of the land is currently constituted, you'd be looking at about 9 miles wide right here. The Jewish history with regard to the land of Israel begins approximately 1300 BCE, before the birth of Christ. Moses leaves Egypt somewhere around 1300 BCE. There are various sort of attempts to date this. A little bit later in the century, Joshua enters the land. He crosses the Jordan River, right? So the Jewish people go out here, they pass through the Red Sea, they end up wandering around in the desert, and then they enter the land of Canaan, right, which is this whole area. By about 1000 BCE, the kingdom of David is established. Jerusalem is the capital, right? This is the first that Jerusalem matters sort of in world history. Remember, still 1,000 years before Christ. By 957 BCE, the first temple of Solomon is built. It is built in Jerusalem. Now remember, this is still a good 1,600 years before the rise of Islam. There's a lot of infighting among the Jews. There's a separation between the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. Those are two separate kingdoms. And you end up with ancient maps that look sort of like this, right? This ancient map is the kingdom of Israel, which was 10 of the tribes. And then you have the kingdom of Judah, which is the one that was governed by the Davidic line. The first exile that happens to the Jews happens in 722 BCE when the Assyrians rush in from the north. You can see the Assyrian Empire at the top of this map. They rush in from the north. Then there's another exile that takes place in 586 BCE. This is the Babylonian exile. So from way the hell out here on this map, the Babylonians come in, they conquer the land, and they destroy the first temple. In 515 BCE, there's this great return from Babylonia, and the second temple is built. In 63 BCE, the Romans take over. So Pompey, at that point, not the emperor, but just a general, takes over the area, and Judea becomes a vassal state. And Judea remains a vassal state of the Roman Empire, basically through the end of an independent Jewish kingdom. It's called Judea at this point. It is not called Israel. 70 CE is the destruction of Jerusalem. There's a Jewish revolt against the Roman government because of bad administrative practices and because of infighting and because of a crackdown on religious practice, and Jerusalem is destroyed. And not only is Jerusalem destroyed, the Second Temple is destroyed at the time as well. 130 to 136 CE, there is a massive revolt by the Jews under a general named Shimon Bar Kokhba, Simon Bar Kokhba. The Bar Kokhba revolt was extremely damaging to the Roman Empire. They had to expend extraordinary resources in order to stop the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is why it was almost an independent kingdom for a solid 4 or 5 years there. They renamed the area Palestine as an insult to the Jews. That's why it was named Palestine. So when people say historic Palestine, understand that the existence of Palestine was meant as a name, as an insult to the Jews, who were considered the historic inhabitants of the land, and it is first used in 136 CE, a solid 1,200 years after the Jews first enter the land at a minimum. Now, finally, we get to the founding of Islam. So Islam finally is founded around the 7th century CE. Arabs take over this land in about 636 CE. In 1099, the Crusaders decide that they are going to take back the land, and from 1099 to 1291, the Crusaders are fighting battles with the Islamic world and establish rule inside Jerusalem and inside Israel. In 1291, the Crusaders are defeated, and a Muslim group called the Mamluks take over. They rule for a couple of hundred years. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire, another Muslim empire, takes over the entire area. Now, understand, since the destruction of the Kingdom of Judea, there has not been a single independent state called Palestine set up anytime in here. It has always just been a territory of an outlying empire, and pretty sparsely populated, actually, because there wasn't a lot there, as it turns out. The Ottoman Empire, this entire time from 1517 to 1918, till the end of World War I, during that time, they really didn't want Jews settling in the land, and so they had barred Jewish land purchase. You actually could not buy land in this area if you were Jewish. Jews started to make sort of backdoor deals with local Arabs to buy their land, and so you start seeing Jews trying to escape various places from which they've been exiled for, thousands of years, back to the Holy Land. There was a constant Jewish presence here. Throughout all of these exiles, there's never no presence of Jews in, for example, Hebron, or in Jerusalem, or in various areas of the Holy Land. But the first major aliyah, which is termed the aliyah in Hebrew, that means to go up, right? Because there's a spiritual rising that takes place when you go to the Holy Land. The first aliyah is around 1882, it's late 19th century, and it's mostly Russians attempting to escape pogroms that are happening in Russia. By 1897, the Zionist movement begins, and this is the idea that there's going to be an independent Jewish state in Israel. It is launched by Theodor Herzl. He's the founder of the World Zionist Organization. He is not a particularly religious Jew. He launches this after the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair was this famous affair in France in which there was a member of the French army who was Jewish. He was falsely accused of spying for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It unleashed this giant wave of anti-Semitism. He was basically condemned despite evidence because of the anti-Semitism, and Herzl decided, well, anti-Semitism is too strong a threat. The Jews need some homeland to call their own. In
to,
1917, Britain declares the Balfour Declaration. This says there will be a Jewish homeland in the area of Israel. The amount of land that was promised to the Jews was actually not just what is labeled Israel here, but also Jordan, which at this time was called Transjordan, which makes some sense in the sense that the Arab states around it were going to be Egypt, it was going to be Saudi Arabia, it was going to be Syria, it was going to be Lebanon. There are a bevy of Arab states that surround this entire region. In 1920, there are Arab pogroms against Jews in Jerusalem. So when people say that there was no conflict between Arabs and Jews until the creation of the State of Israel, that's just a lie. It's not true at all. There were major Arab pogroms against Jews in Jerusalem because Jews wanted to commit the great sin of praying at the Western Wall. This, of course, was not allowed. In 1922, this is post-World War I now, the British are given a mandate over the area of Palestine. They start walking back the promises of the Balfour Declaration. The Brits separate off Transjordan, and they call it Jordan, and they say that's going to go to the Arabs. In 1929, there's another major riot, another major anti-Jewish riot in Hebron, or Hebron. The British, in response to all of this violence and all of this rioting, they decide they're going to just continually attempt to appease the Arab population in British Mandate Palestine. So they begin restricting land transfers to Jews. In 1937, the Peel Commission suggests a partition plan with control by the British retained of Tel Aviv and Jaffa and Jerusalem. And there would be like a small sliver of land Israel would get, but it would be pretty divided. It'd be like this little land here, maybe a little bit up here, and then most of the Negev, which is basically just an empty desert. By this point, Jews have been moving to Palestine in increasing numbers because anti-Semitism in Europe is getting worse, but also because there's this nascent labor and Zionist movement, and they're really making the agricultural areas flourish again. Economic growth in this region at this time is because Jews were moving in and they were bringing their resources with them, they were bringing their know-how with them, and they were working the land. And this was driving more Arab immigration to the land also, because economic activity always drives population movements. In 1939, under Arab pressure, the Brits restrict Jewish immigration to 75,000 Jews per year. The Jews are saying, listen, we have like millions of people who want to move here. And the Brits say, we're not doing that, 75,000 per year, because we have to get along with the Arab population. This is just before the Holocaust, obviously. And the Arabs reject this. The Arabs are very angry about this. They continue to launch low-level attacks on the British. They continue to attack Jewish populations. World War II breaks out. The Jews, including Jews who were heavily pushing the British to establish a Jewish state and to lift restrictions on Jewish immigration into British Mandate Palestine, they side with the Brits, right? They form their own divisions. They're trying to help the British. What they say is that we fight for Jewish immigration to Palestine as though there were no Germans, and we fight the Germans as if there were no British, right? That's the way the Jews see it in British Mandate Palestine. They're attempting to negotiate. The Arabs side with Hitler. Okay, during World War II, you have Hashmin al-Husseini. He is the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, one of the Palestinian leaders at the time, the Arab leaders at the time, and he was literally meeting with Hitler, attempting to encourage Hitler to establish a final solution in the Holy Land should the Germans be able to conquer that area, which the Germans came pretty close. I mean, you had Rommel literally in Egypt, right? Rommel was over here. Okay, so fast forward, you're now after World War II. Still, the British Mandate is limiting the amount of Jewish immigration into British Mandate Palestine, because they're attempting to keep this conflict between the Jews and the Arabs simmering at a lower level. Okay, 1947, there's a UN partition plan, because now the British Mandate in Palestine, they want to end it, they want to withdraw, they don't want to be there anymore. So the UN says, okay, we're going to vote on a partition plan. It retains Jerusalem as internationally governed. Okay, so it would not have been Jewish territory or Arab territory, it would have been internationally governed. It's just this fragmented, ridiculous state. Okay, the state for the Jews would have been like a slice here, a little bit of a slice of the coastal area here, and then the Negev desert down here. The Jews are like, give us whatever you got, right? Whatever you're going to give us, we will take. The Arabs instead decide that they're going to launch a bunch of low-level conflicts. So there's this kind of low-level, quiet war that's going on for about a year, with Arabs attacking Jewish settlements and attempting to kill Jews, and Jews attempting to defend themselves. May 14th, 1948, the British Mandate officially ends. Israel declares its independence, right? This is Yom HaAtzmaut, or as the Arabs like to call it, the Nakba, right? They call it a disaster that Israel was established. The leader of Israel at this time is David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion is no right-winger. He's no hardcore right-winger. Ben-Gurion was a labor socialist. Ben-Gurion was very much in favor of a wide variety of negotiations. He was quite anti-religious in sort of his own persona, but he understood the necessity of there being a Jewish state. In their founding documents, they ask the Arabs to stay. If you read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, they explicitly say, we want to be a state for all of our citizens. Yes, we're a Jewish state, but we want Arabs to stay. We want them to become citizens. Instead, all of the surrounding Arab countries declare war. Israel is surrounded on every side by hostile states. every single side, right? So you got Lebanon up north, you got Syria here, you got Jordan, you got Saudi Arabia, you got Egypt down here. And then there are a bunch of far-flung states that are also getting involved, right? Morocco was part of the 1948 war. You have a bunch of states that have decided they are going to invade and they are going to destroy Israel. Like they're just going to strangle it in the crib. And they're openly saying this. And not only are they openly saying this, they're telling the Arabs who are living in the Jewish areas, get out and get out of the way so our armies can come in and we can wipe the state off the map. Well, that's not how it ends up, right? The way that it ends up is that the Jews end up basically retaining pretty much everything that's on this map, with the exception of the old city of Jerusalem, right? So Jerusalem ends up basically split down the middle. Jerusalem is not controlled by the Jews at this point. The Temple Mount is still controlled by the Jordanians. The way that people speak about this particular period is as if there was a Palestinian state at this point. There was not. By 1964, the Arab states have decided that they need almost a propaganda effort here. So they create the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Palestine Liberation Organization is a terrorist group. It explicitly calls for the destruction of Israel. Now, you will note, at this point, Israel does not control any of this or any of this. So when they say Palestine Liberation Organization, they mean this whole thing, right? That whole thing is supposed to go away because Israel doesn't even control that at that point. And they're not calling for Palestine to be liberated from Jordan or from Egypt. They're calling for the complete destruction of the state of Israel. Okay, so in 1967, the Arabs mobilized for all-out war. And this includes Egypt, it includes Jordan, it includes Saudi, it includes Syria. This is going to be the big war where they finally get rid of this nascent Jewish state that is less than 20 years old, right? And this is just less than 3 decades after the Holocaust. And Israel instead launches a preemptive war. They see this coming. They destroy the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground. And in 6 days, they proceed to take the Golan Heights, which is this area of Syria. Israel takes over the entire Sinai Desert, takes all of Judea and Samaria to the Jordan River, takes all of the Gaza Strip, takes control of the old city of Jerusalem. Right? They do all of this in 6 days, which is why it's considered a miracle by the state of Israel. I mean, it's an unbelievable military performance. So in 6 days, they take what was going to be the war for their destruction, and they proceed to expand their borders from this tiny thing to this, and all of this. Israel then proceeds to give up like all of it, right? So Israel keeps the Golan Heights because that's a military necessity. The UN calls for Israel to withdraw from occupied territories. Now, the language here matters if you care about the UN. I don't happen to care about the UN. I think it's a garbage organization. But if you do care about the UN, there's a resolution put forward by the UN Security Council. It calls for Israel to withdraw from occupied territories, not the occupied territories. Now, that makes a difference because if it said the occupied territories, presumably it would mean anything Israel won, it would have to withdraw from if you care about the UN, which you really shouldn't. But it says occupied territories, which means subject to negotiations. The 67 Arab League summit happens, and they agree in Khartoum, Sudan, on the 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. And these are the 3 no's that are going to govern the Arabs all the way through. Basically until now, until the Abraham Accords. These were the 3 no's that mattered. And this is all the way in 1967. So whenever people talk about there needs to be a 2-state solution, why couldn't they have come to an agreement?
Honestly,
because literally one side said there will be no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations. One side has accepted every single peace deal provided to it to this point in time. And one side has said we will not accept any peace deal. And yet somehow there's a moral equivalency between the 2 sides. Explain that one. Okay, 73. Holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. Everybody is fasting, everybody is praying, and a surprise attack is launched on the state of Israel. The prime minister is Golda Meir. She gets caught completely by surprise. They were warned, and they didn't take it seriously. Israel suffers extraordinary casualties in the 73 Yom Kippur War, and then once again maintains or expands its borders a little bit. 79, Camp David Accords. Finally, there's a breakthrough. Menachem Begin takes over as prime minister of Israel, a very right-wing prime minister. There were 2 major parties in Israel at this time, Likud and Labor. This is the first Likud prime minister. And one of the things that he does is he comes to a peace accord with Anwar Sadat, who is the nationalist leader of Egypt. And in those peace accords, Israel gives up the entire Sinai Desert. Israel gives up the entire thing to Egypt in return for basically a cold peace. Anwar Sadat is then assassinated. In 1982, the Jordanian monarchy is deeply...
Dungeon Alchemist is an AI-powered map-making application that allows you to make...
afraid that the Palestine Liberation Organization is going to overthrow the monarchy. They expel the Palestinians. The Palestinians end up in Lebanon, tens of thousands of Palestinians. Palestinian terrorist groups begin firing rockets over into Israel from South Lebanon. In 1982, Menachem Begin launches a war in Lebanon. Israel ends up basically going all the way up to the capital of Beirut and nearly occupying the entire country. And then they end up withdrawing under international pressure in what is considered sort of a disastrous war for the state of Israel. As always, whenever Israel withdraws from a territory, terrorist groups take over and then threaten Israel. This is the constant pattern. No matter, the only time this has not happened is with regard to withdrawal from the Sinai Desert. 1987, the Intifada breaks out. This is the Palestinians in the Judea and Samaria region. The reason that I use the terms Judea and Samaria as they are more historically accurate. People call it the West Bank. Why? Because Jordan occupied it, and this is the West Bank of the Jordan River. So the only reason that it's referred to as the West Bank, which is really historically anomalous, right? It's on the east side of Israel, but it's on the West Bank of the Jordan. That's a holdover from the time when the Jordanians occupied this entire area. Again, no one cares that Jordan occupied quote-unquote Palestinian land or that Egypt occupied quote-unquote Palestinian land. They only care when Jews occupy historically Jewish land. That's when things start to get really hot and bothered. Okay, so anyway, the Intifada breaks out in 1987. You get these widespread riots and violent confrontations and terrorist attacks all the way from 1987 to 1991. By this time, Yitzhak Rabin has taken over as Prime Minister of Israel, and pushed by George H.W. Bush, the government of the State of Israel starts negotiating with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is a really weird shift considering that Yasser Arafat is a master terrorist responsible for tons of murders on his hands. He, at this point, has been expelled all the way to Tunis, right? He's not even in the picture. And Israel brings him out of retirement, basically, and says, why don't we negotiate with you? And maybe you can make all of this stop. So in 1993, they signed the Oslo Accords, and that is where you get Bill Clinton presiding over one of the least successful international negotiations in the history of international politics. The Oslo Accords have been a complete and utter failure. That ends with Yitzhak Rabin, who's this historic general who has been Prime Minister of Israel a couple of times by this point, shaking hands with a mass murdering terrorist, Yasser Arafat. And this was going to initiate a new period of health and accord, and there was going to be peace. All that the PLO had to do was acknowledge that Israel existed and had a right to exist, stop educating their children in terrorism, and cease the violence. They couldn't do any of those things, right? So none of that happened. Instead, there's an uptick in violence, pretty dramatic uptick in violence after the Oslo Accords. In 1998, Israel again attempts to make some sort of concessions to the Palestinians, this time under the first tenure of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel does not want to govern these areas. Israel is not interested in governing millions of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip or in Judea and Samaria. The last thing they want to do is have their soldiers wandering around these dangerous areas or to preside over these areas. All they want, and all Israel has ever wanted, is to separate off from these particular areas and say, listen, you guys rule yourselves. Like, just stop bothering us, please. Okay, and you will see that this is the continued pattern. 2000, Israel engages in the Camp David negotiations. Bill Clinton is still president at this point, and the Prime Minister of Israel is now a guy named Ehud Barak. And Ehud Barak is a real dove. Ehud Barak wants to make as many concessions as humanly possible, right? This picture here, which is just an unbelievable picture. Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak trying to push Yasser Arafat into negotiating, right? They're all joking, they're all happy and all this kind of crap. Ehud Barak offered everything. Ehud Barak offered complete control over the Temple Mount with just like a little bit of a recognition that Israel has a historic claim religiously to the Temple Mount. Arafat turned it down flat. He offered control over virtually all of Judea and Samaria. He offered control over the Gaza Strip, right? A Palestinian state, boom, done. Arafat does not even negotiate. He just launches a massive round of violence. I remember this because I was actually in Israel right about the time they launched the Intifada, and there were suicide bombings on a fairly regular basis. They blew up a Sparrow's pizza shop. I was supposed to be at that corner like a couple of hours later. This was a thing that was really scary. It was really violent. Remember, he launched that not after Israel did something aggressive. He launched that after Israel offered him everything he could possibly want if he weren't a damned liar who just wanted Israel wiped off the map. This, again, is the great lie, is that there is desire for a two-state solution from the Palestinian side. So far, there has been no evidence whatsoever that this is the case. Okay, 2004, Arafat dies, and Mahmoud Abbas takes over. Mahmoud Abbas is himself a terror supporter. He wrote his entire doctoral dissertation on Holocaust denial and why it's correct. Israel, in 2005, under the auspices of Ariel Sharon, who's one of the great hawks in Israeli history, right? He was the general in the 1973 war who ended up pushing all the way down close to Cairo. He was called the bulldozer. He's this famous general. He unilaterally withdraws from the Gaza Strip. There are a bunch of Jewish areas right in the northern tip of the Gaza Strip. Jewish soldiers went in and removed Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. These are places people have lived for decades. They removed them, and they just turned them over to the Palestinians. Hamas, a terrorist group, immediately rushed in and burned everything. They burned the greenhouses, they burned all the Jewish houses, they knocked down all the good infrastructure, and then they just took over the place. This is when you start to see a difference emerging among the Palestinians in terms of governance. You've got Judea and Samaria, the West Bank here. You've got the Gaza Strip here. In 2005, Abbas wins the Palestinian elections, but only because Hamas and Islamic Jihad boycott the elections. Okay, in 2006, after Israel withdraws from Gaza, remember, Israel's not in control of anything here now. Hamas wins an election. So the first move is not, oh, look, Israel wants to make concessions and make peace with us. The first move is, why don't we elect a terrorist group to actually represent us? Okay, in 2008, Israel's response to this is, what if we just offer you everything? So Ehud Olmert becomes prime minister of Israel, and he proceeds to offer everything to Abbas. He gives him basically the same offer, but better than the offer that Barak gave in 2000. He offers everything. He offers Judea and Samaria. He says, we're going to keep some of the big Israeli settlements that exist here, but we're going to give you land swaps. You can keep the Gaza Strip, everything. Abbas does not even bother to issue a counteroffer. He just walks away from the table and launches violence. Gaza war begins 2008, missiles flying in from Gaza. This is the first Gaza war. Israel has to go in Operation Cast Lead and shut that down. 2014, this breaks out again. Another giant rocket attack from Hamas in Gaza. Israel has to go back in 2014 and shut it down. And that brings us to today, 2021, another Gaza war in which Hamas has decided to launch rockets at the state of Israel. The real reason for that has nothing to do with land disputes in Jerusalem. The real reason has to do with the fact that Mahmoud Abbas was about to hold an election in April. He canceled it because he knew he was going to lose to Hamas. As always, the best way to garner support when it appears that you're about to go down is to start blaming the Jews and start trying to kill them. You can start an arms race between yourself and Hamas on how many Jews they can kill. So that brings us to where we are right now in 2021. A few decades ago, private citizens used to be largely that. Private. Well, what changed? The internet. Think about everything you've browsed or searched for or watched or tweeted. Now imagine all of that data being crawled through and collected and aggregated by third parties into a permanent public record. Your record. Having your private life exposed for others to see, it was something that celebrities used to have to worry about, but nobody else. But now, when everybody is online, every single person is basically a public figure. To keep my data private when I go online, I use ExpressVPN. Your business, secure yourself with the #1 rated VPN on the market. Visit expressvpn.com today. So Hamas is an actual terrorist group. Fatah, which is the military wing of the Palestinian Authority, is a terrorist group as well, and Islamic Jihad. So you have 3 terrorist groups running this area right here. And again, Israel has no interest in running those areas. It's the last thing that Israel really wants. It's the reason why Israel has not gone and reinvaded these areas or thrown Hamas out. They don't want their soldiers in these particular areas. What Israel has done, because they don't wish to be involved in these full-scale wars, is they've developed the Iron Dome system. So the Iron Dome system is really an incredible piece of technology. Okay, so Hamas has been firing rockets at the center of Israel. Israel is a very, very tiny state. If you were to fire a rocket from the Gaza Strip to Jerusalem, you have about 90 seconds warning before the rocket hits. Tel Aviv, which is up here, if you hit Tel Aviv, that's again a 90-second warning. If you're in Ashdod or Ashkelon, which are down here, you're getting like 15, 30 seconds warning before the rocket hits.
It honestly is really impressive.
When the tides of war seemed insurmountable, when all hope appeared lost, extraordinary...
Israel develops this incredible technology called Iron Dome. This is what an Iron Dome battery looks like. You can see that they load up the battery with a bunch of essentially anti-missile missiles. That's what they are. There is an enemy rocket that is fired. Israel has these very precise radar systems that track the rocket launches. Then there's a control system that estimates the impact point where it's going to hit. And then they fire a launcher to intercept the missile. And it doesn't bother defending against rockets that are going to land in the middle of nowhere. They have these batteries that are set up in all of Israel's major cities. Iron Dome is basically a technological miracle. They're hitting a bullet with a bullet. And they're doing so with no time to basically figure out how to do it. It's right now succeeding at about 90% rate, which means, by the way, that Israel gets to be nicer to Hamas than it otherwise would be. Because if all these rockets were actually hitting all the populated areas of Israel, Israel would just eviscerate Hamas. Like any other state, it would have no choice but to go in on the ground and just finish the job. Which is why, if Hezbollah in the north, and the northern Lebanese border, decides that it wants to launch a war against Israel, they have way more ordnance than Hamas does. And so Israel would be forced to go in full scale and just do what it would have to do. Israel is being incredibly pinpointed about the way that it deals with this conflict. It's dropping knock bombs on top of buildings. They're bombs that basically shake the building and say, get out. And then they bomb the building after everybody gets out. They're calling building managers and telling them to leave. We have tape of them telling building managers, clear the building, and the building managers being like, well, we don't want to. And the Israelis saying, well, yeah, but there are kids inside. And the building manager being like, okay, well, if you kill kids, then it's a good propaganda win for us. It's unbelievable. And yet somehow the world sees some sort of moral equivalence there. Now, there are some international political implications that have changed in the recent past with regard to Israel. I've dealt with just specifically here the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But one of the things that has happened that is really quite massive is that if you go back here, Israel currently has a cold peace with Egypt. Israel has kind of a cold peace with Jordan. And because the Obama administration really has strengthened Iran, the 3 no's of Khartoum, which you'll remember were no peace, no recognition, no negotiation, they've completely disappeared for a wide variety of Arab states, which have decided, guess what, the Jews aren't our enemy, Iran is our enemy. And so this is how you ended up with the Abraham Accords, where the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, all of which have been supportive of these various wars of extinction against the Jewish state, have now decided that they're going to form a quite warm peace with Israel and recognize Israel's existence. That fundamentally changed the math on the ground. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is trying to walk that back by attempting to provide support to the radicalized Palestinian government of Fatah or of the Hamas or of Islamic Jihad. Alrighty, so let's talk about what exactly happened in the last couple of months that resulted in this round of new violence. Why don't we begin with the Abraham Accords? The Abraham Accords were this monumental shift in how people thought about the Middle East. So for decades, the conventional wisdom is there will not be peace between Israel and all these surrounding Arab states. It's the reason they call it the Israeli-Arab conflict as opposed to Israel versus the Palestinians, because it was supposed to implicate all of these various countries because of the three no's of Khartoum. Right? The idea was that until Israel made some sort of deal with the Palestinians, there would never be peace in the region, ever. No one could ever recognize the presence of Israel until Israel made concessions to the Palestinians. And so under that impression, Israel kept being like, okay, we'll make this concession and this concession and this concession. And the Palestinians kept being like, well, okay, we'll take those concessions, and also we're not going to do any of the things that you want us to do. So this was completely exploded by the Trump administration and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and mostly, ironically, by Barack Obama. So during the Obama administration, there was a real shift in how the United States treated Iran. So Iran has been threatening Israeli extinction since the Iranian Revolution of '79. They've constantly been
The hell?
shouting death to the Jews, death to America, destroy the Zionist entity. This has been part of their pitch for a very long time, and now they were developing nuclear weapons. And so Barack Obama had this bizarre vision of the Middle East in which the United States would be able to minimize its presence by essentially setting up Iran as a counterbalance to Saudi Arabia. They would create this realpolitik situation in which Iran had been newly moderated in some bizarre way, and they'd pushed off the nuclear agenda just long enough to get those moderates in power, and then they would be welcomed into the family of nations, and there would be this sort of balance of power between the Sunni and the Shia in the Middle East, and this would solve all problems. This was Barack Obama's new idea. It was a terrible idea because, as it turns out, there are no moderates in the government of Iran. It is run by the mullahs. This whole fake notion that the moderates were going to be emboldened by U.S. concessions was complete crap. So the Iranians continue in secret to foster their nuclear development. The Iranians take all the money that the United States is now allowing Iran to receive and spreading terrorism all over the region.
No.
So if we had a bigger map of the Middle East, what you would see is that down at the tip of Saudi Arabia is Yemen. And so there's a proxy war going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Yemen. The Houthis, which are an Iranian-backed terrorist group, are fighting Saudi-backed groups in Yemen, and it's led to tremendous death. The United States had basically, under Barack Obama, moved away from alliances with both Israel and with Saudi Arabia, and had moved toward this sort of bizarre warmth with Iran, which is a state that wishes fully to destroy both Saudi Arabia and Israel. Well, this forced Saudi Arabia into saying, wait a second, our enemies here are not the Jews. The Jews don't care about us, right? The Jews are not bothering us. The Jews don't want anything from us. The Jews just want to live there. And here we have this Iranian state that's actually trying to blow up like our oil resources and destroy our country. And what would be awesome is if we could form some sort of kind of covert alliance. And so all of the Saudi sort of proxy states, including the UAE and Bahrain and all the other Sunni states in the region, decided, wait a second, our enemy is not the Jews. Right? Our enemy is the Iranians. And so they started fostering relations in kind of covert ways with the Israelis, to the point where even during the Obama administration, there was talk about how Israel might use Saudi Arabian airspace in order to strike at Iran, which is located over here on the map. There's all this kind of new ties that are being forged. The new Egyptian regime, which is a regime that had been Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood took over after the Arab Spring. That was much vaunted. It was supposed to heal the world in all of this. Really didn't. The Muslim Brotherhood was ousted. General al-Sisi took over in Egypt. He's been much friendlier with Israel. The Saudis have been much friendlier with Israel. Then along comes the Trump administration, and they decide they're going to turn decades of conventional wisdom about the Israeli-Palestinian issue and its centrality on their head. So the idea was, if you can force Israel into making enough concessions, and if you can just stop them from saying that they like Jerusalem and they want to keep Jerusalem, if you can just stop them from doing all this, maybe you will wheedle the entire Muslim world into accepting Israel's presence. The Trump administration comes along like, nah, this is nonsense. Okay, so we can see these burgeoning ties between Israel and these Arab countries. The Palestinian issue is a completely different issue. It's completely separate. So instead, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make very clear to everybody that we actually back Israel's right to exist, and we back Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, and we back Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. We're going to take those off the table. The Arabs no longer have a right to expect that Israel is going to give that stuff up, because we say that we're not going to push them on that. And we are going to foster ties between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And shock of shocks, it turns out that all these Arab nations decide our enemy ain't the Jews, our enemy is the Iranians. And so we really should foster ties with these folks and create this sort of new regional security bloc. And that's exactly what happened. Okay, Joe Biden takes over, and Joe Biden decides, come on, man. And he says, we're going to ditch all of the progress that was just made. We're going to pretend the Abraham Accords never happened, and we're going to start making overtures to Iran. Simultaneously, we are going to undo another Trump administration policy. So the Trump administration made very clear, we are not going to pretend that we are honest brokers between Israel and a bunch of terrorist groups. Instead, we are just going to make clear our support for Israel, and we're going to withdraw funding from, for example, Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and the UNRWA and Hamas. We're just going to take away the funding from these various organizations. Biden comes in and he says, I'm going to restore the status quo ante. I'm going to try and get back into the Iran deal and allow Iran to foster terrorism with U.S. taxpayer dollars and with us allowing money to flow into Iran. I'm going to restore aid to all of these Palestinian terror groups. And so the Palestinians are like, okay, I guess now's a good time to push. And the Iranians are saying, okay, now's a good time for us to push because we have an administration in power that obviously is not pro-Saudi, that is obviously not pro-Israel. So if we push a little bit, we'll see kind of how far we can push here. Factor number 2 is that the Palestinian Authority has not held an election since 2006. Mahmoud Abbas was last elected in 2005. He is now in the 16th year of a 4-year term. So when people talk about Israel as undemocratic and apartheid, 20% of Israel is Arab. There are Arabs who sit on the Supreme Court. There's a major Arab party called Ra'am, which is part of the Israeli Knesset. It's just a lie that Israel is an apartheid state. The true apartheid state is the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. 0 Jews live there, and they've not held an election in any of these areas for nearly 2 decades. So Abbas, in an attempt to appease the Biden administration and the incoming Democratic power base in the United States and the international community, he wants to show that he's legit. We're going to hold an election, says Mahmoud Abbas, who's I believe 80 years old. It turns out nobody likes Mahmoud Abbas. So Hamas looked like it was about to take over not just the Gaza Strip, but also the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And so, like a couple of weeks before the election, Abbas was like, you know what? Bad idea, no elections. And knowing that this was going to set off a conflagration, Abbas starts pushing violence against Israel. The Fatah, who control all television in the West Bank, they start putting out videos about how it's good if you can kill a Jew. They start really ramping up a lot of the anti-Israel rhetoric. There are a bunch of incidents in which TikTok videos are taken of Palestinian youths in Jerusalem beating up Jews, and these are being celebrated. So there are a couple of pretexts that are used in order to redirect from I'm canceling the election to it's all the Israelis' fault. So in the it's all the Israelis' fault category, there are particularly 2 issues that they've been pushing. One is that the Palestinians were barred from entry via the Damascus Gate, which is a gate into Jerusalem, entry to the Temple Mount. Now, there were some roadblocks placed there because Israel was afraid that people were going to congregate and riot, which they promptly did as soon as Israel removed the roadblocks. So Israel removed the roadblocks, people congregated, they rioted, they did violence. Okay, this was used as a pretext to say that Israel was restricting access to the Temple Mount. I've been to the Temple Mount. Muslims have full and free reign over the Temple Mount. The Islamic Waqf controls the Temple Mount. They have since 1967. Israel won back all of the old city of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, and Moshe Dayan, who was the general of the Israeli army at the time, he handed over the keys to the Temple Mount to the Islamic Waqf. And so Jews are not allowed to pray openly on the Temple Mount right now, which is insane. The Muslims complained that, on the one hand, worship wasn't being allowed there. Not true. 100% not true. During the middle of this chaos, by the way, 100,000 Muslims went up there during Ramadan, at the end of Ramadan, to pray on the Temple Mount. Doesn't sound like very good restriction of religious rights there. Okay, so a bunch of Fatah and Hamas members take over Al-Aqsa Mosque. They bring in rocks from the surrounding area. They bring in projectiles. They start throwing them at police. They put Hamas flags on the top of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a terrorist group, a genocidal terrorist group. They start attacking the Israeli police. When the Israeli police go and shut it down, then they say, oh, Israel is being aggressive in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's why we need to start firing missiles. Okay, that is reason number 1. It's a pretext and it's a lie. Reason number 2 is this long-standing legal dispute over an area of Jerusalem known as Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is sort of an outskirt of Jerusalem. It's a little suburb. It's known by Jews as Shimon HaTzadik. It's known by Arabs as Sheikh Jarrah. Okay, so in the 1870s, there were a bunch of Jews who arrived in this area of Jerusalem, and they bought up a bunch of plots of land in Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik, he's a Talmudic era sage, and so his grave is supposed to be there. So Jews bought a lot of the territory that are right around. They have all the legal land bills and all of that. Heavy Jewish population in Sheikh Jarrah up until the 1948 war. The 1948 war happens, and as mentioned, Jordan takes over this entire arena, including the old city of Jerusalem. And they proceed to put barbed wire there, and Jews aren't allowed in, no freedom of worship, the whole deal. During that time, the Jordanian government hands over to some people in Sheikh Jarrah legal title to those homes. So say, we took this over, here's a title, you own the home now. Some people, they didn't give legal title. For whatever reason, it got caught up in the bureaucracy, or these people they didn't particularly like. For whatever reason, they don't have the legal title to those homes. Israel in the 67 war wins back Sheikh Jarrah, Shimon HaTzadik, and all the people who had the legal title, they're like, okay, well, I guess you live there now. all the people who didn't have legal title, the people who were the previous landowners came with the legal title, and they said, okay, this is our land, we want our house back. And the Israeli courts came up with a solution, and their solution was, you can continue to live in the house, but you have to pay rent to the people who own the legal title, which frankly is not a bad solution. For 50 years, the Palestinians who are living there don't pay rent. For 50 years. So the heirs and assigns of these particular land titles decide, you know what, we actually would like to knock down these 4 houses, and we want to build an apartment complex there. This is what this whole thing is about, supposedly, which it isn't. It's just a normal real estate dispute over eviction and terms of rent and all of this. And an Israeli court finds, okay, well, they haven't paid rent, so they're going to be evicted. This is held up, right? The Israeli government says, we're not going to implement this right now. We want this to go all the way to the Supreme Court. It'll be adjudicated there. This is used as a pretext by the Palestinians to riot. It is used as a pretext by Hamas to fire rockets into the area. And the suggestion is this is Israel being aggressive and engaging in ethnic cleansing, which is weird because there are plenty of Arab families living in Sheikh Jarrah who are not being evicted because either A, they paid their rent, or B, they actually had the legal land titles to the homes in which they were living. East Jerusalem is still extremely heavily Arab. For a country that's being accused of ethnic cleansing, Israel is markedly incompetent at ethnic cleansing, considering that the population of Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem has vastly and exponentially increased over the course of the last 50-odd years. Those are the pretexts for the conflict. The actual reason for the conflict is Abbas canceled the elections, he ramped up the violence, and Hamas, in competition, said, okay, well, if Fatah's going to ramp up the violence, we can't be left out, man. A party's a party. And so they start firing rockets into Israel at civilian centers. Now, what Hamas does, because they're a terrorist group, is they put all of their rockets in civilian areas to try and stop Israel from attacking them, because they know that Israel actually cares about civilians, whereas they do not. A lot of the foreign aid that was being granted and given to Hamas was not being used for actual aid. It was not being used for electricity or water. Israel's been providing electricity and water to the Gaza Strip for free for years. Hamas didn't use any of this money to actually build up infrastructure or help people. They used it to build these giant terror tunnels and stock up on rockets. These rockets, by the way, being provided by the same Iranian government that the American government is currently attempting to negotiate with under Joe Biden, which makes no sense at all. It's also the reason why, by the way, why 200 Democrats just voted last week that they would not place sanctions on any company that was doing business with Hamas or donating money to Hamas. There's a bill in 2019, identical bill, said cut off funding to any company that does business with Hamas. It passed unanimously in the House. Now that Joe Biden is president and trying to negotiate with Iran, 200 Democrats voted it down and never saw the light of day in the House of Representatives. That is where things currently stand. Israel is attempting to do what it can to wipe out Hamas's capacity to fire rockets indiscriminately at its civilian population without having to actually do a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip, because frankly, there are no good solutions there. If Israel goes in and wipes out Hamas, then maybe Islamic Jihad takes over, maybe Fatah takes over, maybe the next level of Hamas takes over. The only thing that has actually guaranteed peace in the region at all for any prolonged period of time was, in fact, Israeli troops on the ground staffing these areas, but Israel doesn't want to be there. And so the two alternatives historically have been Israel has to subject itself every few years to a barrage of rocket attacks, go in, knock out some infrastructure, you get a couple of years of peace, same thing happens in a couple of years, or you have to have a long-term, quote-unquote, occupation in which Israel basically attempts to pacify by keeping a certain baseline level of troops in a particular area. So, as you see, it took a very long time just for me to go through the basic history of this conflict, and that's the very basic history of this conflict. There's a lot more there. There are a lot of resources out there, but suffice it to say, the media members who try to boil this down to just a border dispute or try to suggest that this is just a matter of Benjamin Netanyahu, it's coming from ignorance and it's coming from stupidity. Do your reading before you bother to comment on the situation. One of the things that you will have noted in the news is that every time there's an uptick in the violence in this particular region that involves Israel, there's widespread anti-Semitic attacks that happen all over the world. You're seeing it happen right now every place from LA to New York to Europe. And there's this argument that's constantly made by people, particularly on the left. Well, if Israel didn't exist, wouldn't there be less anti-Semitism? Well, first of all, as we've talked about, you'd have to ignore every bit of history from 136 CE all the way to 1948 to get to that point. There's something quite ironic about somebody beating a Jew in the street over Israel saying, if Israel didn't exist, I would stop beating this Jew. The reality is that not every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, of course, just like not every criticism of the United States is anti-American. But every anti-Semite is anti-Israel, every single one. And there's a heavy crossover between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism for sure.
You're giving me a good feeling.
We tell the stories that matter most.
You're giving me a good feeling.
Let's watch this one.
Many people think of Israel and Palestine as two countries at war, with this one, a state for Jewish people, occupying this one here, where Palestinians live. The truth is, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians live all over this territory, ruled by one government and one army, based on the idea of
advancing the supremacy and domination of one group of people, Jews.
And that is what guides its policies and its practices towards Palestinians.
In other words, apartheid.
I don't know if it's exactly apartheid.
Apartheid is a loaded word tied to the racist South African regime of white minority rule. But although the word comes from there, apartheid isn't just a description of what happened in South Africa. It's actually a crime against humanity under international law. In 2021, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of carrying out apartheid. It based this accusation on the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute, which say that 3 elements have to occur for the crime of apartheid to apply. They are an intent by one group to dominate the other, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, and one or more inhumane acts, like denying people the right to leave and to return to their country, expropriation of landed property, and the creation of separate reserves and ghettos. So let's see if any of these apply to Israel's rule over Palestinians.
About half of the people that live here under Israel's rule are Palestinian, and the other half are Jews, like myself.
For those 7 million Israeli Jews, almost the entire land is one space. Whether they're here, or here, they have the same rights, privileges, and legal status. They can move freely, vote in the same elections, and live under the same laws. The boundaries are invisible to them. But for the 7 million Palestinians, the boundaries are very visible. Whereas this is essentially one space for Israelis, Palestinians have been divided into 4 areas. Each area gets a different colored ID card issued by Israel, and your life and rights are determined by that
Gaza
ID card.
is right
In
here,
Gaza,
that's where they
Palestinians
attacked
have
from.
no freedom of movement and are under a complete Israeli blockade. Israel no longer has
Although,
soldiers inside Gaza, but it
Egypt, I
controls
don't know
every
what-
aspect of life from the outside.
Do they not? Can
People
they,
in Gaza
are they,
have no civil or political
blocked
rights.
in through
They've got no
Egypt,
say in
too?
the Israeli government that controls them. Palestinians in the West Bank also have very limited freedom of movement, with their population divided into 165 disconnected cantons, cut off by Israeli military checkpoints, walls, settlements, and other infrastructure. They also have no civil or political rights in Israel. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians generally have more freedom to move, but Israel can take away their right to live in the city. They can't vote in Israeli elections, and Israel also bars them from taking part in Palestinian politics. Palestinians who are citizens of Israel can travel relatively freely, but they face restrictions on
that's
where they
where they
can
are.
live. They can vote in Israeli elections, but face legalized discrimination. Yara Hawari is a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship.
This ID system, it penetrates, all areas of life, where you live, where you study, what you work, etc. Even the more intimate areas of life, such as who you marry.
That's because for the most part, a Palestinian can't pass on their ID status to their spouse.
And this has huge implications on where they can live. Many indeed actually end up leaving and choosing to live abroad because it is that difficult.
On rare occasions, Palestinians are able to change their
those ones
ID,
are running
but
away.
only in one direction.
So for instance, if a Palestinian from East Jerusalem moves somewhere else inside the West Bank, they could lose their residency in East Jerusalem, and Israel, since it's considered that a downgrade, then that's a direction that would be feasible. And further down the line, again from Israel's perspective, if West Bankers move to the Gaza Strip, then that's a direction that Israel will accept, but not in the opposite direction.
So while Palestinians are granted different rights, basically one space for Israelis, Palestinians have been divided into 4 areas. Each area gets a different colored ID card issued by Israel, and your life and rights are determined by that ID card. In Gaza, Palestinians have no freedom of movement and are under a complete Israeli blockade. Israel no longer has soldiers inside Gaza, but it controls every aspect of life from the outside. People in Gaza have no civil or political rights. They've got no say in the Israeli government that controls them. Palestinians in the West Bank also have very limited freedom of movement, with their population divided into 165 disconnected cantons, cut off by Israeli military checkpoints, walls, settlements, and other infrastructure. They also have no civil or political rights in Israel. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians generally have more freedom to move, but Israel can take away their right to live in the city. They can't vote in Israeli elections, and Israel also bars them from taking part in Palestinian politics. Palestinians who are citizens of Israel can travel relatively freely, but they face restrictions on where they can live. They can vote in Israeli elections, but face legalized discrimination. Yara Hawari is a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship.
This ID system, it penetrates, all areas of life, where you live, where you study, what you work, etc. Even the more intimate areas of life, such as who you marry.
That's because for the most part, a Palestinian can't pass on their ID status to their spouse.
And this has huge implications on where they can live. Many indeed actually end up leaving and choosing to live abroad because it is that difficult.
On rare occasions, Palestinians are able to change their ID, but only in one direction.
So for instance, if a Palestinian from East Jerusalem moves somewhere else inside the West Bank, they could lose their residency in East Jerusalem. And Israel, since it's considered that a downgrade, then that's a direction that would be feasible. And further down the line, again, from Israel's perspective, if West Bankers move to the Gaza Strip, then that's a direction that Israel will accept, but not in the opposite direction.
So while Palestinians are granted different rights based on their IDs, nowhere do those rights match those of Israeli Jews. Looks like we can check off at least one of the elements required for apartheid to apply. When Israel was founded in 1948, 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been forced out. The result was that the new state had a Jewish majority. To maintain that majority, Israel has never allowed the refugees to return. The Palestinians who remained were given Israeli citizenship, although they were kept under strict military rule for 19 years. But in 1967, when Israel occupied more lands, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, it faced a problem. It wanted the land, but didn't want the Palestinians on that land. So it's refused to extend citizenship to the rest of the Palestinians under its control, while keeping them under military rule ever since. To further control the ratio of Palestinians to Israeli Jews, Israel still bans Palestinian refugees and their descendants from moving into any of the territories it controls, while encouraging any Jewish person anywhere in the world to immigrate to Israel, even if they've never set foot there before. In Jerusalem, the Israeli authorities actually have a population target: 60% Jews to 40% Palestinians. Palestinians in Jerusalem are only granted a permanent residency permit, even if they've been living in the city since before Israel was founded.
About 350,000 Palestinians are in that status, and which is Orwellian, the way it's defined, because the only thing permanent in permanent residency is that it can actually always be taken away.
These permits can be revoked if a Palestinian moves out of the city, but Jewish Israelis living in Jerusalem never lose residency, even if they move to the other side of the world. This discrimination has been enshrined in Israeli law. The 2018 nation-state law says that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, and that the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. That means that even Palestinians with Israeli citizenship aren't considered equal to Jews with Israeli citizenship. As Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu put it, Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people, and only them. So let's go back to that list from before. The nation-state law is only one of many Israeli laws that explicitly discriminate against Palestinians. For example, there's the 1950 Absentees Property Law. Deeming Palestinian refugees absentees, Israel seized hundreds of thousands of acres of their land, even though they were only absent because Israel wouldn't let them return. Remember, denying people the right to return to their country is on the list of inhumane acts that legally make up the third element of apartheid. There are more Israeli policies that could fall under the category of inhumane acts, especially when it comes to land.
So Israel desires the land, even more so desires empty land, or land that it makes empty, and doesn't desire the Palestinians living on that land. And that has resulted in policies in which land is constantly moving in one direction. Land that used to be Palestinian becomes state land, and then that land is allocated for the development of towns and communities for Jewish citizens.
And yes, expropriation of land is also an inhumane act. So let's see what that looks like on the ground. Across the entire territory, Palestinian communities are overcrowded and surrounded by Jewish-only communities.
It's the same type of practice of encircling Palestinian communities so that they can't expand, cutting them off from one another. It's a continuous practice that began in 1948 and was expanded to the West Bank in 1967.
The Israeli state prioritizes Jewish development in places where it wants to restrict the growth of Palestinian communities, with the government keen to Judaize areas like the Galilee and the Negev.
Israeli politicians frequently use that term to Judaize an area, in other words, to ensure Israeli Jewish dominance in a particular area, where the government has a concern over the Palestinian demography. And in any other context, this would be condemned as, gross ethnic engineering. It's in its basic laws, which is essentially the Israeli constitution. The land is deemed for the Jewish people, not the Israeli people, but the Jewish people.
In fact, only 3% of the land inside Israel's 1948 borders is allocated for its Palestinian citizens. Meanwhile, hundreds of new communities have been built for its Jewish citizens, many on the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages. Plus, there's the 200 illegal Jewish settlements that have been built across the West Bank as well. At the same time, thousands of Palestinian homes have been demolished or are under threat of demolition, having been built without permits because Israel rejects most Palestinian building applications. Meanwhile, in the Negev desert, the Israeli government wants to maximize the land available for Jewish development. So it has tried to force Palestinian Bedouin citizens into small townships by demolishing their homes and not allowing them to connect to the water and power grids. One village, El Araqib, has been demolished more than 180 times.
Now, just across the Green Line, a similar struggle is taking place in the village of Susia, which is in the West Bank, just south of Hebron. And it too has faced a series of mass demolitions by authorities in an attempt to establish Israeli Jewish control over the area.
Looks like we can check off another one of the criteria for apartheid. Israel has total control of this entire territory. Even in Gaza and the West Bank, which have some limited autonomous Palestinian administration in place, Israel controls the borders, trade, resources, water, electricity, the airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, the population registry, and more. Accusing a government of carrying out a crime against humanity like apartheid is no simple matter. But we've seen how Israel's control over and discrimination against Palestinians fits the legal threshold for apartheid. Israel's own leaders knew this was happening, although they didn't do much to stop it.
The state that you have at the moment is an apartheid state, isn't it?
It's not yet apartheid, but it might come on this slippery slope toward apartheid.
Still, how could apartheid apply to Israel when, say, Palestinian citizens can vote?
But it does not condone
as a Palestinian
what they
citizen
have
of Israel,
done,
I cannot question the fundamental constitution of Israel, which says that the state is for the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone. My citizenship doesn't allow for inclusion in that state, and so therefore participation in Israeli elections or in the Knesset is really nominal and has no potential to change policy.
Another argument against the accusation of apartheid is that the occupation is only temporary, and when it ends, Palestinians will rule themselves.
Normal people don't think that 54 years is temporary. We've passed that line already a very long time ago. And yeah, there's a lot of Israeli propaganda insisting on that worldview of democracy plus temporary occupation. No, it's not a democracy and it's not a temporary occupation. It's one regime between the river and the sea, and that regime is apartheid.
I serve the king. I think not.
Our heritage is ingrained in our skin because you can take Alfa Romeo out of Italy, but you best believe you can't take the Italy out of an Alfa Romeo.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine been under Ottoman rule for centuries. It was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states. One for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and flames.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
The settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the First Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, and that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today.
Yeah, see?
It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering
That's crazy
Palestinians,
that 2 million
often
people
respond
live in
with
that
protests
little
and
area.
sometimes with violence. The most just
I think
want
it's like
normal lives.
2.2 million people.
In Gaza,
live
Hamas
in
and
this-
other violent groups
because
have
the
periodic
size
wars
of
with Israel.
Israel is like the size
The
of
fighting
New Jersey.
overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace.
Armies could take to the seas should you wish it, sire.
No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
All right. Now let's get into what's going on.
नमस्कार दोस्तों, इजराइल और पैलेस्टीन के बीच में एक बार फिर से जंग छिड़ चुकी है। 7 अक्टूबर सुबह 6:30 बजे की बात है, जब ज्यादातर इजरायली लोग अपने घरों में।
If you live in Montana, you could lower your electric bill to less than $30 a month. How?
With some significant news in that forceful and emotional speech, sharing that now 14 Americans have been killed in what he described as an attack of sheer evil, terrorism, and confirming now for the first time officially that Americans are among those being held by Hamas. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who is live for us in southern Israel, not far from Gaza. And Richard, you heard the president there making crystal clear that the U.S. stands with Israel.
We did, and also as he was speaking I was hearing Israeli jets flying overhead, heading toward Gaza. Israel at this moment is carrying out retaliatory strikes across the Gaza Strip. It is attacking Hamas infrastructure. It is attacking the homes of Hamas leaders. It is attacking tunnels, Hamas infrastructure. It has been intensifying the Israeli military campaign since Saturday, and over the last 24 to 48 hours, it has been intensifying significantly. The big question, however, is will Israeli troops cross the border? Will they enter into the Gaza Strip and conduct some sort of ground operation? If they do, they could put the lives of the hostages, including those Americans, at risk. So what we're seeing now is mostly a softening campaign. Israel is destroying Hamas. It is trying to cut off the region. It has cut off all supplies of electricity, food, water going into Gaza. So it is imposed a siege on the area as it bombs it from the air, and its troops are building up around the Gaza Strip for a potential invasion. But Hamas is also still on the attack. Hamas is continuing to fire rockets into Israel. We saw some of that ourselves today in the city of Ashkelon. But most of the Hamas rockets are being shot down by the Israeli defense system, the Iron Dome. And what you heard from President Biden say is that the U.S. will make sure that more Iron Dome ammunition is provided to Israel, because I can tell you they are going through a lot of these Iron Dome anti-missile defense systems in order to shoot down the Hamas rockets.
Richard, you laid out one of the crucial questions here, which is how close might the Israeli military be to a full-on ground attack on Gaza? Do we have any sense at this point, based on the reporting you're doing, based on what you're seeing as you are on the ground there, as to how close that may be?
I don't think it's imminent. I was along the border for several hours today with Israeli troops. There is a buildup. There are tanks and armored personnel carriers going into the region. There could be a surprise development, but I did not see any kind of buildup that would indicate an imminent attack or an imminent push. I think we would see a much greater degree of mobilization. So right now there are negotiations underway with Egypt and Qatar.
So even Jim Jordan
to try and free some of the hostages. But just in the last few minutes, right before this announcement by President Biden, I spoke directly with one of the top negotiators, and he told me that so far the negotiations are not leading to any breakthroughs.
Thanks for watching.
So
Stay
Jim
updated.
Jordan, he's the one who is running for Speaker of the House.
Recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the continuing attacks on Israeli civilians by Hamas militants in the
But
Gaza Strip
he's
are a shocking
really
reminder
like
that Israel's very
isolationist,
existence
so I'm
has been threatened
surprised
throughout
that
its
he
7 decades
wants
as
to
a
help
nation.
out Israel.
We strongly condemn these attacks and the terror campaign being waged against our Israeli allies. As a sovereign country, Israel not only has the right but the responsibility to protect its own citizens. No nation could be expected to withstand these assaults
without acting in its own defense. And even in its military response, under constant threat of further attacks, with air raid sirens driving hundreds of thousands of Israelis to bomb shelter, Israel has shown remarkable restraint. Hamas has certainly not. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government should have the full support of this Congress and this president as it works to end the waves of terror coming out of Gaza. As the Prime Minister said in this chamber 10 years ago, Israel is the one anchor of stability in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, we must continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel, united against all threats to its peace, stability, and its very existence. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Want your video to stand out? Go to motionarray.com. Logo, templates, music, presets, simple drag and drop. Titles, intros, there's no limits. You can do it all. Just
This conflict is underscoring the dangers of having no Speaker of the House in Washington. Without a Speaker and no firm timetable for electing a new one, House business has ground to a halt. Scott McFarland is on Capitol Hill with how the power vacuum is affecting U.S. support for Israel. Scott, good morning.
And Nate, Congress can't resume its work, including new aid or additional munitions for Israel, until a speaker is chosen, and there is just no clear timetable for that. The candidates will meet privately with the House Republican Conference later today here at the Capitol, with an internal vote among Republicans no earlier than tomorrow, and then there has to be a full vote in the U.S. House. The two candidates so far, House Majority Leader Steve Scalise of Louisiana. He's pitching himself as a unifier. Jim Jordan, House Judiciary Chair from Ohio, who has former President Donald Trump's endorsement. But as of this morning, neither candidate has a clear path to the 217 votes needed to be Speaker, with no expected support from Democrats. Amid the uncertainty, former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who was booted a week ago today, didn't rule out returning to his job. Multiple Republicans told CBS News they would support McCarthy coming back, but he'd still likely come up short without the support of those 8 defectors who voted him out last week. With no end in sight to the impasse, Congress can't even pass a resolution to denounce the attack on Israel, which, Vlad, both parties overwhelmingly support.
All right, Scott, thank you very much.
Now the congressional response says the need for an imminent new Speaker of the House is heightening this morning in the face of war in the Middle East following the stunning ouster of Congressman Kevin McCarthy. In a motion brought by Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, 8 House Republicans sided with all 208 Democrats to force the removal of McCarthy as Speaker. McCarthy says Gaetz has a personal vendetta
it's kind of
against
crazy
him,
that
which
right
Gaetz
after
has
this
denied.
happened,
I spoke with both men on this program in the last month. Watch.
But it's not something I lay out
Hamas
there
attacked
that
Israel.
Matt's mad about an ethics complaint. It's an ethics complaint that happened in the last Congress that Matt went to other members saying, I'm going to try to influence Kevin to get involved in an ethics complaint. I can't do it. It's illegal.
My vendetta is against a Washington system that allows corruption to put the interests of lobbyists and PACs above the interests of the American people. Kevin McCarthy facilitates that system, and I do deeply resent that.
House Republicans will meet this Tuesday on a candidate forum. Also, a secret ballot is being held on Wednesday. The nominee will need 218 votes to succeed. A full House vote is expected later that day on Wednesday. So far, Congressman Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise have announced their candidacy.
I wonder how long
right now in
it's
this
going to
Sunday
take,
morning
because
Futures
last
Exclusive
time
is
they
the chairman
tried
of
to
the House
vote for
Judiciary
someone, it
Committee,
took
Congressman Jim Jordan,
I think
who
15
President
days.
Trump has endorsed for the Speaker's role. Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for being here this morning.
Good to be with you, Maria.
I want to first get your take on the war in the Middle
I
East,
hope
the
that Jim
war
Jordan
on Israel,
does
and whether or
become
not
the
this is
Speaker of the
created
House.
a heightened need for an expedited process to get a speaker in place.
Well, we need to get a speaker in place as soon as possible, someone we can unite around, but you're exactly right. I thought Senator Cotton said it best. We need to give Israel the time, the space, the resources so that they can win and win decisively and send a message to these evil people who did this to our great friend and great ally, the state of Israel. And understand that I think every American is praying for the folks in Israel as we speak right now. But I had the opportunity yesterday to talk to former Ambassador Friedman. I talked to Chairman McCall. We do need to get together and get the resources there and the support there so Israel can win. There is a special bond between the state of Israel and the American people. I've been to Israel 5 times. The way we can work together and help them it's been a long history of that. We need to make sure we continue that and help them win this as quickly as possible.
Do you support additional funding to Israel? What do you want to see in terms of that support? What does that look like?
I want to give them what they need to win. And we've been doing that with David Sling and Iron Dome, these weapon systems, that we've worked together with Israel to make sure that they can defend themselves and stave off all these evil terrorists who want to come and attack the Israeli people. So I want to do what it takes to win this. But I think Senator Cotton was right. Typically how these things shake out is after a while, there's this push to have Israel restrain themselves. No. Not like this. This happened on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. It happened on Shabbat. This was intentional evil actions by these terrorists, and we need to make sure that they have what they need to win and send a message to stop this kind of ridiculous stuff and take action against these people
This is surprising
who are doing
that
these terrible things.
Let me turn to the speaker's race and this candidate forum on Tuesday and then the vote
because
on Wednesday. Can you walk us through how this plays out?
He's very isolationist.
Well, I'm running because, look, I think I'm the one candidate who can unite our conference and then go tell the American people what we're doing and why it matters to them, why it's important to their family, to their community, to their small business, why it's important what we're doing for our country. The American people right now, Maria, I think they are so thirsty for leadership. And I don't think they're seeing it from the White House. I don't think they're getting it from the Senate. House Republicans need to unite and show the country that we're fighting for them. Think about what they see every day. Crime in the streets, 10,000 illegals coming across the border every single day. The price of food, what it costs to put gas in their car. I mean, they are hungry for leadership. We need to come together and show the American people we're fighting for the things they care about that will make a difference for our great country.
As Speaker of the House, what would be your direction in the face of war in the Middle East right now? We are looking at a candidate, yourself and Steve Scalise, vying for the job. You know, President Trump has endorsed you. He wrote on Truth Social over the weekend that he would like to see you as Speaker of the House. But tell me what your first directive would be as Speaker.
To help the state of Israel. There will be some resolution on the floor to support the state of Israel. We will consult with Chairman McCall. We will consult with the Senate. We'll work with the State Department and the White House. But that is something that I think gets bipartisan, bicameral, full support from the United States government. Because again, this is our great friend and great ally, the state of Israel. So I think that's front and center. And then, frankly, the next order of business is to deal with what's coming on November 17th. And I will outline a plan that I think we have to have. When we walk out of that room next week, we got to have 218 votes for a Republican speaker, and we got to have 218 votes for how we deal with November 17th when the funding bill for the government comes due. We need to have a plan for how we're going to deal with that. And I will outline that in front of my colleagues on Tuesday when we get together.
You have been talking with many of your colleagues over the weekend. Steve Scalise is also asking colleagues for their support. Can you give us a sense of whether or not you feel you have those votes?
We've got amazing feedback and incredible feedback from our colleagues across the country, across the spectrum in the Republican conference. I mean, we got conservatives to what's termed more moderate members. We got 3 committee chairmen for me. I feel very good about that support. And again, I think it boils down to those fundamental questions. Who can unite our conference? Who can bring us together so that we can lead for the American people? And then who can go tell the country what we're doing here, what the things we're working on, the things that matter to them and how it matters to them, how it impacts them and their family. Yeah. That's what we're supposed to do in politics. We're supposed to do what we told the people we were going to do. We're supposed to focus on them and help them, their families, their communities. That's our job. That's what we need to focus on.
Congressman, beyond Israel, beyond the spending fight, many people are looking at President Biden's foreign policy as well as the corruption that we have seen in plain sight. You have been leading this investigation into the weaponization of our federal agencies. Yeah. What can you tell us about those investigations now that there is no speaker in place? You may very well be leaving to become the speaker and leaving the Judiciary Chairman job. Will those investigations be ongoing?
They sure will. We already, as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, we already work closely with Speaker McCarthy's office. That communication, that collaboration is there. I mean, just on basic things, to get subpoenas issued, you have to consult with the Speaker's Council, the House Council. There's already that working together amongst the three key committees, the Ways and Means Committees, the Oversight Committee, and Judiciary Committee, and of course the Speaker and the Speaker's staff and the House Counsel. So that will continue. That's part of our constitutional duty, Maria. We're supposed to provide oversight of the federal agencies, and we've been doing that. We've been doing it aggressively. We've been doing it in a way that's consistent with the Constitution, and we've been making a difference. There have been changes in these agencies because of the work we're doing.
Yes.
That I think protects Americans' liberties and freedoms. So that work will have to continue.
Damn it.
Are you expecting to subpoena Hunter Biden?
That will be a call for the committee chairman. Right now, Chairman Comer has subpoenaed Hunter Biden's business records. He wants to get that information and then make a decision on that subpoena. But those come from Speaker of the House doesn't issue subpoenas. The chairman of the respective committees issue those. And I'll be fully supportive if Chairman Comer wants to go that direction.
Congressman, thank you. We'll be watching important upcoming days. Congressman Jim Jordan, thank you for being here this morning. We appreciate it.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.
Joining me right now in this Sunday Morning Futures exclusive is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jim Jordan, who President Trump has endorsed for the Speaker's role. Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for being here this morning.
Watch this.
Good to be with you, Maria.
Yeah, sources tell myself, my colleague Courtney Kuby, that the U.S. intelligence officials are now considering enhanced intelligence sharing with their Israeli counterparts. Now, I want to be clear, no official decisions have been made, but as they discuss this surprise attack that they've all agreed they've been caught off guard on, according to our sources, they're looking at a plethora of options, from drones to satellites and other options as well, that they are considering in the wake of this attack. I also want to point out that no lawmakers, I'm told, have received classified briefings on this. Even top officials from the intelligence committees, even those members of that so-called Gang of Eight of the top leaders here on Capitol Hill. Former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy actually talked about this last hour. Take a listen to what he said.
There is nothing the House can do until they elect a speaker, and I don't know if that happens quickly. The speaker is part of the Gang of the Eight that takes action to be able to have the briefings and others. But think about this. Why would you ever remove a speaker during a term to raise doubt around the world?
Now, McCarthy has also been tweeting that he's spoken to the Israeli Knesset today, the Speaker of the Israeli Knesset, somebody that McCarthy has visited in Israel a couple of months ago when he made that trip, months before he invited President Isaac Herzog to come deliver an address over the summer, a joint address ahead of the 75th anniversary of Israel's independence. This is clearly somebody who is acting still as if they are Speaker, as we have an interim Speaker, Patrick McHenry, with open questions as to what he can even do in terms of receiving this classified information that eventually, I'm told, lawmakers with that kind of power will begin to get as the administration learns more of exactly what happened behind the scenes here.
Oh man, I'm getting tired. I'm just not feeling it today.
Johnson, why are you naked? Because my t-shirt sucks. Look at Gibson. He's wearing a true classic tee. It fits him tight in all the right places, but leaves the perfect amount of room in the front. God, I hate that guy. He looks so damn good in that shirt, he can basically do whatever the hell he wants around here.
What should be done here?
Reaction to the war in Israel reaching the streets of New York with dueling protests.
All I think is that America should stay out of it.
Hundreds of demonstrators standing in solidarity with Palestine, taking over the crossroads of the world. To organizers of this rally, the attack on Israel was justified resistance.
It's 75 years of an Israeli regime that is founded on violence.
This comes just a day after an air, land, and sea attack on Israel by Hamas militants, where hundreds of Israelis were killed, women and children were also taken from their homes. This man tells Pix 11 News, while he is standing with Palestine, he does not condone killing innocent people.
I think any resistance is legitimate when it targets military targets. I don't think the civilians should ever be in a position to feel threatened, be they on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side.
At times, counter-protesters standing across the street were chanting and yelling, waving the Israeli flag and singing their national anthem. For them, this was a terrorist attack.
They massacred us yesterday, kids in their beds, women, old women. They massacred us, 600 people, Israelis dead, massacred in their own beds. What are you protesting for, you barbarians?
And at times, just talking to us got emotional. This woman says she should be in synagogue for the Jewish holiday.
Since yesterday, I have not been able to.
She says her daughter, niece, and other family and friends are in Israel.
They're okay, but nobody's really okay. I know of 3 families whose sons were kidnapped. One of them was murdered.
Police created barricades and extra protection is needed, with the crowds on both sides growing larger. At one point, those standing with Palestine started moving towards the east side.
2 wrongs don't make a right. Israel bombed them first, so that was wrong for them. I feel like the Hamas shouldn't have retaliated.
Tonight, the crossroads of the world becoming a deep dividing point, with Palestinian supporters on one side of the street.
What brought you out here today?
To stand against the oppression that's been occurring in Palestine for over the past 5 decades.
Palestinian people have had enough.
While yards away, a tense face-off with dozens standing up for Israel.
We have a right to exist. We're not doing anything wrong.
I have friends who live in Israel. I have family who live in Israel. I've seen violence there before. We've all seen that, but this is really on another level completely.
As you can see, emotions are running high. This rally is now on the move. We're told they're headed straight to the Israeli consulate.
Palestine will be free from the river to the sea.
And similar scenes playing out across the country.
Right to resist, right to resist, right to resist.
The growing movement on both sides heightening security from coast to coast. The NYPD keeping close watch on the ground and in the air, launching drones to monitor today's events. While in Salt Lake City, police increased patrols following unspecified threats targeting Jewish institutions. Synagogues in Miami Beach and Beverly Hills ramping up their presence too. Tonight, the crisis in the Middle East fueling demonstrations thousands of miles away. But despite the conflict, some hope for peace.
People around the world need to be hopeful, here in America and around the world, because whatever divisions we have, our humanity supersedes them.
And Kathy's with us here in New York. So New York City's taking some extra measures now?
Kate, that's right. We saw that today, and we understand that those extra efforts will extend to synagogues and mosques until further notice. Kate?
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media. Back here in the U.S., rallies held across the country Sunday in support of Israel. These were just some of the demonstrations we saw from Los Angeles to New York to Florida. We saw similar demonstrations across the country in support of Palestinians as well. From New York to the nation's capital and in Seattle, huge crowds came out to make sure their voices were heard. San Francisco City Hall lit up in blue and white tonight in support of Israel after a passionate demonstration earlier today from supporters of both sides.
Top look at the financial district this afternoon. Police were called out, but there were no reports of violence between the groups. Betty Yu has the story.
Dual
Unruling demonstrators faced off outside the Israeli consulate in downtown San Francisco Sunday.
Resistance is justified.
Over violence in Israel. The pro-Palestinian rally called All Out for Palestine comes one day after Hamas launched a surprise attack that killed hundreds.
I am Jewish, and I am ashamed of what Israel is doing to the people of Palestine. I was in Palestine a month ago. I saw for myself how the Palestinian people are being oppressed.
El Cerrito resident Seth Morrison held a sign that read, "Jews for Palestinian Liberation." Impassioned protesters carrying signs and flags on both sides yelled, "Free Palestine" and "Free Israel." SFPD officers in riot gear and barriers kept the two groups separate as tensions rose.
What do you think of this surprise attack that happened Saturday?
You know, violence won't solve anything. But when our people are oppressed, when they're held in the conditions of Gaza, like they're in prison, how can you blame them? You know, many of us have been saying that the Palestinians are going to rise up. They're not going to, and you cannot expect them to sit on their hands.
San Francisco resident Jay Connor said he wanted to show support for his Jewish friends.
It's abhorrent, it's terrible. There's no reason why anyone who should be out vacationing, having a party, should have to be kidnapped, hostage, raped and murdered and beaten. It's just shocking, and it's the fact that we're still even arguing Jewish existence in 2023 is pretty shocking to me.
Killers, murderers, and standing here in front of the Israeli, how shame, how unforgivable.
Both sides marched in different directions following the rival rallies.
The unfortunate thing is if we were to move forward, they'd have to resolve the problems out there first, because obviously out here you can see there's two different degrees of anger and frustration.
There's a lot of shouting going on, but what would you like to tell that side?
What I would like to tell them.
I just wasn't feeling that great. Just tired. But I'll try to have more energy next stream. Hopefully they'll be having the vote in the Senate. I mean, not in the Senate. What the hell? The vote for the House Speaker. And that will, I'll know more about that. Because I don't really know much about, I mean, I learned more today about the, about Palestine and Israel conflict, but I don't know that much about it to really want to comment on it, you know? It's not something that I've really studied that much, but I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you. Peace.